Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We are today having another webinar as part of the Doing Ecological Economics webinar series hosted by the International Society for Ecological Economics. And they have the pleasure to have with me here Cynthia Mitchell, that is going to talk about her recently published commentary on ecological economics, focusing on Max-Neef and the great transdisciplinary swindle. And we'll talk more about it in a minute. But before that, I would like to ask Cynthia if you could briefly tell us a bit about your kind of background and trajectory and how you end up doing this kind of detective research work.
Paula, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation this evening or this morning, wherever you are in the world. So I'm coming to you from Melbourne in Australia, and so here in Australia, what we do is to acknowledge the Indigenous people. So I'm on the lands of the Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung peoples of the East Kulin Nation, and this area was traditionally known as Naarm. So I pay my respects to those Indigenous ancestors and acknowledge them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this place. My roles now, I'm a Professor Emerita of Sustainability at the University of Technology in Sydney. And I am the founder and principal of a small consultancy, just me, called The Good Ancestor. And that name is taken from Davrick Leggett's poem of the same name, which is both kind of heartwarming and heart-wrenching about, where we are in the world at this point in time. At the University of Technology, Sydney, where I was for 20 years, I was at the Institute for Sustainable Futures. And that's a really interesting organisation because it sits outside of the faculty structure. It's had its 25th birthday last year, that institute. I was deputy director for that 20-year period and helped grow the institute from about 10 people to about 150. And what's unusual about the institute is that it works in a very applied kind of a way. So the mission of the institute is literally to help create change towards sustainable futures, and it's self-funding. And so what it means is that we work in a very normative way. So we're doing research, but it's very applied. If you're familiar with Boyer's models of scholarship, Ernest Boyer's models of scholarship, he talks about discovery, application, integration, and teaching. So we're absolutely in that integration kind of space. So for us and for me, transdisciplinary research has been fundamentally about making a difference in the world. So that's the kind of orientation that I've brought to this work. If you go back far enough, my background is engineering and science. And when I first joined academia a very long time ago, I got very interested in teaching learning. So I was president of the National Engineering Education Association and that kind of thing. So I've got that long history of learning. And for me, learning and change are, like kind of two sides of the same coin. And so when we talk about creating change towards sustainable futures, regenerative futures, and when we talk about transdisciplinary research, designing that research in a way that facilitates learning and facilitates fundamental questioning of how we are in the world is important, because we need those kinds of changes in order to be able to, create a world worth living in for those who will come after us. So that's the kind of orientation. The other thing to say is that I started off and led our postgraduate research program for about, I think, 13 years or 14 years at the Institute. So I was looking for transdisciplinary frames, or looking for research frames, theoretical frames that would support people who were working in very applied kinds of ways.
Yeah, it's interesting that this has been around for so long, when sometimes it just feels like we're starting to really do things in this manner. Yeah, something that I mean, yeah, I really like about the article, and I'm gonna put the link to it on the comments because it's open access and people can have a look at it,
Yeah.
and I really recommend reading it if you haven't. But I find it has lots of layers in the commentary, because there is the kind of layer about questioning how we do science, but then also about transdisciplinary in itself. So just to start with, because some of the people may not have had the chance to read the paper yet, the commentary, I was wondering if you can kind of maybe take us through the kind of starting point of Max-Neef, and then how you kind of
Sure,
and
sure.
wave that.
Sure. So if I go back, I started at the Institute for Sustainable Futures in 2001, and back then, this idea of transdisciplinarity was hardly spoken about, and what we had was people working in people coming into the institute with different backgrounds, working in different sectors, and really the only thing that brought them together was their focus on sustainability. And so my interest as the person who was responsible for helping these postgraduate students get through their degrees and be able to graduate at the other end was to find scaffoldings that would give them and us and examiners and paper reviewers the confidence that that the quality, the required quality, was evident in their work, and I came to realize that quality is a function of discipline, and it certainly is a function because it's a function of worldview, and so that's the kind of space that I was in when I was looking around for what is there some coherent framework that might provide a function for us. And so I was aware of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary kinds of things, but when Max-Neef's paper came out in 2005, it gave us a language that hadn't been available to me at that point. So me and the program and the institute kind of grabbed to that and went, here we go. This is the answer. This is the thing that we can use. We can point to and say we're doing that kind of work and it matters for these reasons. But as and the paper is written as a narrative because it was a bit of a journey of discovery, and I can talk more about that a bit later on. But 10 years later, I finally was able to get a copy of Eric Jansch's presentation to the 1972 OECD Interdisciplinary Education Conference. So it's he and Piaget and others, and it's a book, that thing, and I had tried originally, and didn't my library couldn't find whatever. Anyway, when I finally got my hands on that original paper, it was like the diagrams in Max-Neef that I knew and had used in countless presentations were exactly the same as these ones in Jansch. I'm like, oh my God, I've been misattributing this thing all these years. And it turned out that I hadn't, but that Jansch wasn't recognized in Max-Neef's paper. And I couldn't believe that, like, maybe it's just an error, I don't know. But so I told my colleagues about it, but I didn't. I should have written to the editors at Ecological Economics at that point, but for some reason I didn't. Fast forward again, another nearly 10 years, and I was asked to review a piece for Ecological Economics that was based on Max-Neef. I had time, and so I did raise it then with the editors, and they gave me an opportunity to write a commentary, and that gave me the chance to dig deeper. And what unfurled was this really interesting thing that I think. So it would seem that that Max-Neef has used Jansch's ideas without attribution. There is a kind of an attribution to an intermediary called Arnold Schultz, to his lecture notes, but it turns out, when I was able to find a copy of the lecture notes, it turns out that actually Max-Neef has used almost all of Schultz's lecture notes. In fact, he's copied them pretty much, and I give some examples in the commentary. But he doesn't attribute Schultz in that way. But in the second half of the paper, of Max-Neef's paper, he quotes at length more kind of authors of more standing in the field than Arnold Schultz was. And so that led to just a whole lot of questions about what else might have been going on here. And because of my history in transdisciplinarity and working with many different disciplines and many different worldviews, and nowadays I would say many different levels of adult development as well, I kind of started to wonder about what could be going on here. And that, in the end, the questions in the paper are a bit about what was happening for Max-Neef. And all these men have passed away now. Max-Neef and Jan Schultz they've all passed away. So we can't ask them what happened here. It's just what I've been able to uncover. And another person might uncover different things. Another person would make sense of these in a different way. But the question becomes one of, it kind of looks like maybe Max-Neef was dismissing Jansch's ideas, because the way that he represents Jansch's ideas, so he takes the graphs, but he misses the point, is the really short way of kind of saying it, misses the point of the complexity that Jansch was trying to articulate. And that was all there when I found Schultz's notes that are referenced in the paper. All of that complexity was there. So Max-Neef did pick up the bits that he liked or wanted to use, but missed these kind of the subtleties, the nuance, the complexities, all of that got missed in the translation. And then he said, and I don't like that model. In effect, he said, this is weak transdisciplinarity, and I think we should be focusing elsewhere. So it was sort of, it for me, it raised a lot of questions about what are we up to as scholars? Because we have this critical orientation, we are taught to be critical as scholars, but are we taught to be reflexive? Are we encouraged to be reflexive? Is it not like, are we accidentally selling ourselves short and selling our disciplines short by kind of narrowing the things that we admit as being reasonable to engage with, having value in our world?
That's another question I had, actually, because one of the things that you say is like lots of these processes are actually, or maybe mostly unconscious process. So how do we actually bring that unconscious bias or like lack of attention that are kind of that might be hidden in our worldviews or the ways that we think, to the consciousness? So how as academics do you think we can be more reflective when these are kind of very hidden processes?
And that's a great question, Paula. And I've spent some time kind of looking into this whole space, as you as you might imagine. And there's a couple of things. I mean, in the paper I talk about mindfulness as one of the paths, which is not normally down on the professional development register for academics, but it is a powerful process, because it's all about noticing what's happening in our minds and in our bodies, and noticing the kind of internal responses that we have to things. The mindfulness is really one way into developing what I would say what I would call reflexivity, and so this is kind of in the realms of cognition in the first instance. So cognition we can split into doing something, taking one step back and reflecting on doing something. So thinking about what we were doing and thinking that, okay, next time I need to sharpen the knife before I try and cut the tomato, because that will work better, that kind of thing. But reflexiving is actually when we take a second step back. And so that's thinking about how we were thinking about what we were doing. It's a little bit kind of hard to get your head around, but it's that idea of taking a second step back. So if you're familiar with learning processes, then this would be triple loop learning. It's that kind of realm. And the really interesting thing is that we don't have a verb in English for this act of thinking about thinking. We have a verb for thinking about what we were doing, but stepping back again, we don't have a verb for it. So I've made one up. Reflexiving. We talk about being reflexive, but we need a verb, a doing thing, not the state of, but because we need to grow our capacity, I think, for reflexiving. And one of the ways I describe reflexiving is it's kind of about stepping out of the waterfall. So what you're doing is trying to gain some distance on you in your own context. And when we do this reflexiving, so that's kind of one dimension is what are we up to in our heads. But the second dimension is what set of meaning making structures do we bring when we're doing that reflexiving. And so this gets into the realm of it's really adult development. And so that's about what we hold to be true. So for most of us, when we're small, our truth comes from, we have a dualistic view. And when you look at across all of the models in adult development terrain, and there are many, they have a pattern. There are lots of them many of them have different kind of stages, but there's a pattern of three kind of overarching stages. The first of those is some form of dualism, where there is a right and a wrong, a black and a white kind of response, and that's the way that we get on in life early on. For most people, at some point, that model breaks down, and we start to develop the capacity to admit multiple worldviews. So that's where Paula is allowed to have her own worldview, and I have my worldview. My worldview is better because it's mine, but Paula is at least allowed to have her own worldview, whereas before Paula wasn't allowed to have her own worldview. She had to have the same one as mine, and this multiplicity kind of thing. For some, and actually all the evidence is that it's a really small proportion of the population, like 10%, maybe less, we are able to move to what some people call contextual relativism. These are not easy terms, but the gist of operating from that basis is that the context determines the truth. So rather than there being a singular truth or multiple truths, it's that the context determines the truth. And in that realm, having different views around the table is essential, because it's the way that allows us to get a rich grasp on whatever this complexity is that we're dealing with. So if you think about transdisciplinary work, you are not going to be doing transdisciplinary work if you have a simple problem to solve, because you don't need transdisciplinary work for a simple problem. It's only complex problems that require transdisciplinary kinds of orientations. And by complex I mean in like a Cynefin sense or something like that. So technically complex things that are literally not predictable. And so if you try and apply a dualistic kind of an approach in a complex situation, it won't work. And equally, when you're doing that reflexiving, if you are being reflexive in a dualistic way, then you still have this really narrow kind of an orientation. So there's something about recognizing when your amygdala starts to get triggered, so when you're in a meeting with someone and you go, and in your head you're going, this person's an idiot. That's a clue. That's a clue that that your worldview is being really threatened. Because what happens is that when something happens when somebody says something that doesn't accord with our value system and our way of making meaning in the world, we go emotional. That's what we do. That's what we're wired to do. And so what we're trying to do in really short terms is to raise our awareness of when the amygdala kind of gets triggered. At our lizard brain. So when the lizard brain gets triggered, in order that we can choose whether to listen to the lizard part of our brain or choose a different response, choose a more magnanimous response.
Yeah, that's interesting. Before we continue, I would like to invite Luis on, who is my colleague at the International Society for Ecological Economics and is just here with us. He had some travels with getting public transport this morning in Denmark, but he's finally here and will join the conversation too. And I would also like to remind the people who are in the audience that you're very welcome to ask questions. You can post them on the chat and we will pick them from there. So feel free to just type up your questions for Cynthia there and we will pick them up. And in the meantime, I just would like to kind of continue on something that you said. And I was also wondering about, the risks that sometimes or that we can face if suddenly we are, very magnanimous or very open, whether there's also certain risk of relativizing value systems. And, yeah, and where is this kind of threshold, right, of things that are definitely unacceptable to us, or things that we need to open up and be able to listen to other views.
Do you have a particular kind of a risk in mind, Paula?
Well, I mean, I'm just thinking, like, I mean, there are like from kind of maybe more extremist views, no? So how do we,
Sure.
think about
Yeah.
issues that, I run
Yeah,
to
sure.
things that might be more pragmatic. So, for example, if you do
Yeah.
non-monetary evaluation and you think like, the environment should not be valued monetarily, but actually you're in a forum with people that advocate for this type of approaches, and your amygdala is telling you like, oh my god, these people talking about, to what extent you should kind of flexibilize your mindset.
Yeah, I think one of the a really powerful response can be to get curious about what other people are putting forward, because I think what the best that we can do is to help ourselves and help others to move along that continuum, so to grow beyond the dualistic kind of a response. And a dualistic response would say monetizing the environment or not monetizing the environment. It's an either or, and it might be a situation where, or it might be that there are situations where that makes sense, and there are situations where it doesn't make sense. So that would be one kind of a response to that sort of an orientation. But I think if we can find the capacity to ask open questions, then that gives it a chance to see what's behind people's orientations. And often there's more agreement on the fundamentals than we might think there is. But it's the way that things are expressed that kind of gets the amygdala going. That means that our responses kind of go, all right then, and then the opportunity for a conversation is lost. But to the extent that we can remain open, and I think there's potential for us to find to negotiate ways forward. And I guess that comes from my interest in systems thinking, and in creating change on the ground, where I think what we're trying to do in transdisciplinary research is to improve the situation in some way that's meaningful for the people who are in it.
On this, I was also wondering, and this is I think a question that also Luison had when we were exchanging via email before the webinar today. To what extent do Max-Neef and Jen's views on transdisciplinary, or like the different forms of combining disciplines, still inform our views today on how we actually do and conceptualize this type of practices?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because of course transdisciplinarity has become very popular. If you look at the number of citations that mention transdisciplinarity, it's sort of, in fact, I need to go this way this way. I don't know. Anyway, it's one of these exponential graphs. you know, and for me, so for some people who come into this field of crossing disciplines, if you like, there's an orientation for some who say, oh, it doesn't matter, you know, multi, inter, cross, whatever, trans, doesn't matter. It's just all about bringing the disciplines together. But for me, I think there is really important nuance in models like Janch's and therefore Max-Neef's that try to distinguish between the ways in which you bring disciplines together, because I think it impacts the kinds of questions that that get asked. And so for me, there's a great deal of value in something like Janch's model, because it distinguishes between these different levels of richness, if you like, in terms of how you bring disciplines together. So it has to do with, for Janch, it was about grouping disciplines in terms of the questions that they ask. And then this for him, it was about how you coordinate how those disciplines come together. And I would say there's another element in there, which is at what point in the process do you bring a transdisciplinary orientation into play, and also who do you bring into the room at different points in the process. So a model like Janch's allows us to bring not only different disciplines, but also different professions, different sectors, and perhaps people who are impacted in a situation but don't have who are kind of stakeholders, if you like, but don't have I don't know, a formal role, perhaps, or something like that. So the idea, I think what Janch's model allows is an expansive orientation to who gets involved and what opportunity they get to influence the questions. And for me, that matters a great deal if our goal is to improve the situation in ways that are meaningful for the people who are in it.
Yeah, thanks. I think Luison has some follow-up questions.
Yeah. Hi everyone. Sorry to be late. I have two questions to elaborate a bit on what you just said, Cynthia, and also on something you said a few minutes ago. A few minutes ago, you said, for instance, if we have a simple problem to solve, we might not need transdisciplinarity. And I wanted to link to what you just explained, because I was wondering whether we should also not reverse the perspective that isn't it the lack of transdisciplinarity that makes a problem seemingly simple, maybe? I would be interested to hear what you think about that. And also, therefore, another question, which maybe is a bit tricky to answer, but I think it's always interesting to think about it, like how to do transdisciplinarity in practice. That is in a way that is not so superficial, that may not end up being just like a kind of a burger of discipline added up to each other, you know, like if you have some thought to share about that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Luison, and lovely to meet you in person. So on that first question about could it be a lack of a transdisciplinary orientation that leads us to misdiagnose, I think is what you're talking about, misdiagnose a situation. Certainly, yes, that happens too. I really like David Snowden's model, Cynefin, as a tool for helping to diagnose different kinds of situations, and I use it a lot in my work with government agencies and industry organisations. And what that model distinguishes between fundamentally is situations that are knowable or predictable, and situations that are not predictable. And I think you're absolutely right, Lewis, on that when we get that diagnosis wrong, and we think we're doing something simple, and we apply tools as if the situation was predictable, will likely make things worse. And I think what leads us to a situation where we do that is these kind of narrow ways of meaning making. only letting in. I think it's two things. One is narrow ways of meaning making, but the other way is what we are taught, I think, as scientists. And by scientists, I don't just mean biochemists. I mean scientists in the kind of European sense of researchers. I think we're taught to draw a boundary, or our culture, if you like, is to draw a boundary around a problem, and in order to be able to kind of investigate that problem, and in the process of drawing a boundary around the problem and excising it and pulling it out, you lose the connections. And when you lose the connections, you sometimes lose what matters. So a thing can appear simple when actually it's not. It's not. So yeah, I think you're onto something with that question. The second question you asked was about how to actually do this in practice. And the answer there is slowly. Well, it's probably two things. One is slowly. By that, I mean, you have to focus on relationships, because what you're trying to do is to learn from the people who are experiencing this situation what really matters to them, and to get kind of beneath the surface descriptions of what's going on. And in order for that to be possible, you have to be able to listen deeply. Here in Australia, there's a wonderful Indigenous woman, Miriam Rose Bauman, who writes about a thing called the DEE, which is about listening deeply. She's not the only person to write about it. It's just a particularly beautiful description, and it sort of accords with that contextual relativism that I was talking about before. It's about being able to give somebody else space to be respectfully heard, kind of thing. So it's something about being able to create and hold spaces where clients or collaborators, however you frame them, feel safe enough to be able to share a little bit more than they would in normal kind of a business orientation. And you know, when I look back over my 25 years now of leading these kinds of projects, one of the reasons why I spent so much time talking about that model earlier, about the reflectiving and the different orientations, is because I think there's something in it. And when I look back over a couple of hundred projects over those decades, there's a pattern. And the pattern is that when I had people in my team and lead people in the organizations I was collaborating with who were able to operate from that place of expansiveness, we made amazing things happen. We were able to change legislation, to make significant shifts in how investment occurs, that kind of thing, to radically change organizational strategies, because people had the capacity to be open to a different way of doing things, rather than being wedded to the current way of doing things because that's the way it's always been, or that's the way that they introduced, and that's the thing. You know, there's a level of kind of attachment to that, and therefore closure, that kind of thing. So it's slowly and with a great deal of respect, but it gets much faster. So that we have to invest in the part that we don't normally invest much in, which is the upfront part. And if we invest in that well, then my experience is that really quite remarkable things can happen. And it aligns with something that a great line from Danella Meadows, who's one of my favorite system scientists. And she says, you know, the thing about systems is that you can't control them. In other words, they sit in that kind of complex realm we're talking about before. You can't control them, but you can learn to dance with them. And therefore, you should start by getting the beat of the system. And that means lots of tea drinking to develop relationships with people in the first instance.
All right, tea drinking. I remember that. Paula, do you want to
yes, I have actually a question that well, I have a couple of questions, but I think maybe let's start with one. One is like, what will have happened, or what do you think will have happened if MaxNeef had kind of acknowledge a bit more on the kind of more relational work of gens.
Yeah. I think, how do you mean, like, how would the paper been different if that had
Yeah,
happened?
exactly.
Or,
And I know this is very kind of hypothetical
yeah,
thinking, but where do you think this will have taken us, or where can we go if we now kind of try to?
yeah. Well, maybe if, to put it another way, if Jansch had the recognition that Max-Neef paper has had,
Yeah,
might be
exactly.
another
Yeah.
way to, that
Yeah.
kind of thing. I think because Max-Neef wasn't seeking, Jansch wasn't seeking to develop a model of transdisciplinarity for its own sake. He was talking about transdisciplinarity in the context of an education innovation system. If we, go back to those 50 years to 1972, it was an education conference, the education conference. And so he was talking about kind of what ought universities do, and what ought the roles of universities be in our society. And I think he alone could not have changed the trajectory of universities. But if we had a model that if we'd accepted a model of an education innovation system that was interested in, that was purpose driven, and where the purpose was, he has this great line. Do I have it at hand? Not sure if I do. The gist of it was that it's about university for the betterment of society kind of thing, and so what that's about is having people who having graduates of a university who have a degree of criticality and who are, I would say, who are developed as citizens of a society rather than as workers for a corporation. At least in Australia, the corporatization of universities has led to an incredible focus on kind of job. The language here is job-ready graduates, and the narrowing of the courses to provide job-ready graduates rather than to provide people who are willing to ask really great questions, who know how to source really great questions and can ask really great questions about what are we up to at the moment as a government, as an organization, as a society, as a corporation, as a community, and is that helping us with where we say we want to go? So growing people who can be critical and who therefore are able to operate from that kind of higher level that I was talking about before, as opposed to helping people stay in a dualistic orientation of right or wrong, black, white, that kind of a thing. I think that would be profound.
Hope there's still time to do that.
I hope so too.
Yes, but yeah, I mean, I think that the trend that you described in Australia about the corporatization of universities, it's something that we are seeing as well in many countries in
Europe.
So,
yeah.
So sometimes I'm not so optimistic, but I want to be optimistic. Anyway.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess the other thing is like when you talk, and I think this is quite important, that the model was developed for the context of the education and the academic system. And nowadays, when we think about transdisciplinary, it's also about other forms of knowledge, not necessarily the ones taught within universities. So, to what extent maybe universities, and have to, get out of the traditional disciplines and also start engaging with other forms of knowledge, and then also think about these models of what it means to do transdisciplinary research or practices.
Yeah, I think it's there's something, it sort of goes back around to your first question in a way, Paula, about you know, how do we come up, how do we approach these kinds of what am I trying to say? If we can grow the proportion of people who are able to have these broader orientations, this contextual relativism, whatever we want to call it, the idea that the context is actually really significant, then I think we've got the potential to be able to you know, hold two truths at once, to be able to grapple with complexity, which is what we need to be able to do now more than ever. You know, with we're facing, you know, even the climate scientists now are saying the data is crazy, making, you know, that kind of, that's the language from climate scientists. And there was a paper at the end of last year that said we're officially in uncharted territory now. So we have to be able to grapple with complexity. But there's an orientation, there's a meaning making, a worldview orientation that's really difficult, and we know it's really difficult to be able to kind of grow the capacity to be able to do that. And so what most of our disciplines do, I think, is to accidentally hold us in this in a binary, in a dualistic kind of an orientation. And I think there are signs of how else we might go about doing this. And at UTS, at my old university, there's I think it might have been, I don't know whether it was the world's first, it might have been, but it's close to. There was a faculty of Transdisciplinary Innovation, something like that was the name of it. And in that faculty was a new program called the Bachelor of Creative Intelligence and Innovation. And that program, you could do it as an adjunct to just about any other kind of degree. So you might be doing, I don't know, a Bachelor of Communications, and you're doing this creative intelligence and innovation thing alongside. And the structure of that degree is, and it's a very process focused degree. So it's not about content so much. It's about process and growing people as humans. And that program has been unbelievably successful. And actually now they're they are successfully franchising it internationally, because it's had such an incredible impact on the young people who are coming into that program. So they do their normal degree, and in the breaks they do intensives in this BCII, so it's called, and you add on a year at the end, which is a focus on this BCII, and then you graduate with 2 degrees, Bachelor of Communication plus BCII, and literally there's almost any degree in the university can be done in parallel with this thing. And so there are models, and what it requires is for academics to be open to those other disciplines. And I keep going back to that model of how we do the meaning making stuff, of how we engage with different worldviews, of what we think truth is. It sort of goes back to C.P. Snow and the 2 cultures, and almost, you know.
Yeah, something that you also argue in the paper, and I was just really looking for it because now I couldn't remember exactly the phrasing, is that you, I think that you say that there needs to be like some alignment, or there needs to be alignment between the ontology, epistemology, and methodology, which kind of makes sense. But what happens when people have different of these kind of sets of alignments? How do they kind of actually start conversation?
Yeah, I think maybe one thing to say on that is just how much trouble we can get into if we don't have that alignment. So, you know, in my work, I do a lot of work in the water sector, and so from time to time I see well-meaning engineers and scientists doing a really bad job of social science because of a lack of respect for what's involved in doing social science well. And so that's kind of what I mean by that, by having that alignment between your understandings of how the world is, and what that means for what kinds of questions are within the realm of your capacity to answer, and therefore what kind of data and what kind of analysis and what kind of interpretation and what kind of claims you make. That alignment matters. And in transdisciplinary work, I think what's required is a kind of an epistemological pluralism often, because if you're doing a transdisciplinary PhD, then likely an individual is pulling from various ontologies and epistemologies, and what that means is that that individual needs to have an awareness of the assumptions that form part of the different disciplines, that are the roots of theoretical frameworks that they're drawing on, for example. And that can be quite a discombobulating experience for an individual. And so to come around to answer your question about how do people who are deeply embedded in a particular discipline start to come up and have that conversation, again, it is about recognizing, about starting with the proposition that other views have value, rather than the idea that my discipline has the best take on this space, kind of thing. So you have to arrive at a conversation like that with an intent to be open to what you might hear. And also, I think one of the things I've heard my disciplinary colleagues say often over the years is that, these people in this other discipline, they're using the same words. Like I recognize the words, but I don't get the way they're being put together, or they seem to have different meaning in that context. And that's it. In some ways, it is different disciplines do kind of use our language differently, or use the same language differently. And so having the humility to be able to ask questions, having a space that feels safe enough, having the humility to ask, being okay with being vulnerable. These are not the standard characteristics that we encourage in academia or in life, but I think they're essential if we are to do this thing of growing our capacity to listen across divides.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because we come back to previous points about the importance of listening and be able to be attentive to what other people have to say,
and also listening to ourselves, because we just and trying to be able to notice when when we're building up walls as well, when we're, because that it can be an unconscious process, a kind of an automatic process, a dismissing of things that are different, and we're biologically wired to do that from a survival kind of perspective. But more and more people are saying we're actually biologically wired to collaborate as well. It's just, I think, culturally that's less familiar. So that's our opportunity.
I think Luison has a follow-up question.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that because and it also touches upon some previous some previous things you said, Cynthia. And here I'm actually using one of Paula's question, preparatory question, because something we really do not do in economics is to use emotions in our own research. There's a lot of research in behavioral economics looking at emotions. But that's the emotions of the people being investigated, right? Not so much about people investigating. And I would say even more, like everything is made, I think, to neutralize the emotions of people investigating. And even though ecological economics has a bit of a specific place within economics, I don't see emotions as being like acknowledged as part of research in ecological economics, at least as far as I can tell. But that's, as far as I know, something that, for instance, anthropologists do much more and are much more able to do. So I would be interested to know a bit, like, Paula had this preparatory question, like, should we be engaging more with the emotional work of doing research? And if so, how? Like, do you have some thought or suggestions about that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question and set of observations that you're making, Luison. And I think it has to do, for me, this has to do with this this kind of almost false dualism again, in that an objectivist orientation is deeply wired into our culture, and a kind of a mechanistic orientation is deeply wired into Western culture, and that is really different from the Indigenous cultures here in Australia, and from what little I understand, Indigenous cultures in other parts of the world, as well. And so we, in academia, in many disciplines, our orientation is that the researcher is separate from, and the writer is separate from this thing that they're engaged in, and that they're producing. And there are some disciplines that are more open to actually acknowledging the fact that we're not. we're not separate. We cannot be separate. We're in it. And the fact that we're in it means that we're impacting on the system in some way. We're making assumptions. We are making decisions. We are including and excluding things that are happening in our assessments, and so forth. And so it's kind of, in some ways, it's a bit scary, because to admit that there's not this degree of certainty, where we've assumed that there is, kind of questions the core of many of the disciplines within the academy, and that's why it's almost it's too scary, and so we just kind of go, and emotions are excluded. So this question about emotions, I don't know that it's emotions per se, as much as recognizing that whenever we step into any arena, we bring ourselves into that arena, whether we are aware of it or not. We must, because we're there. And so growing our awareness of what does it mean when we bring ourselves into that arena, what are we permitting and what are we excluding? I think that's the foundational thing. We can still choose to write in a kind of independent way, but if we are able to do so with an awareness of what we're including and excluding, rather than to do that kind of blindly, then I think the opportunity again for richness and nuance and interventions that might actually make more of a difference, I do think it grows, it gets better. So we don't all have to become anthropologists, but if we grew our level of self-awareness, that would be a really good start.
Yeah, certainly academia would benefit from it. Paula?
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree. And I think there is more and more emotional work, at least going into kind of sustainability sciences, which has been traditionally a very kind of objectivist discipline. Yeah, we're heading into the last few minutes of the webinar, so I wanted to pick up more on the question on that you mentioned very at the beginning, like on how it was to write a commentary that read not necessarily as the kind of traditional kind of academic paper, and I found that so refreshing, and I just wanted to, hear how it was for you, and whether this is something that you will think about doing for another type of research, or this was kind of just a one-off, taking out of your chest all this knowledge.
Thank you, Paula. And initially I didn't. Well, partly there's a few things that come into play here. One, it was a commentary, so I felt like there was maybe there was a little more room for something a bit different. And when I first started to write, it just it came out in that kind of a way. And when I tested that idea with a few colleagues, that they kind of went, I think this works. So I kept going with it, and And then I had this really interesting experience with the editors, 95% of the way through the process kind of thing. So we'd been through 2 rounds of review, and a couple of senior editors then got involved in the process, and one of them was really uncomfortable with the structure as it was, and was seeking a major rewrite. And by that stage, I think we're about 3 years into the process, and I just thought, oh, I can't, no, I can't, I can't. And so I thought, well, it could be that what's happening here is one of those worldview mismatches. So what if I make it explicit by talking about that alignment piece around, because in transdisciplinary research, I've written a bit on what constitutes quality in transdisciplinary research because of those problems I was talking about before, where you're drawing theoretical frameworks from lots of different epistemological orientations, and you need to get those frameworks to talk to each other in a meaningful way if you're going to be able to make an argument for the questions that you're asking, the data, the interpretation, etc., etc. And so this question of alignment is a really central one, and the narrative style does fit with the sort of the data as it was revealed in this process. Like it was an unfolding kind of a process. And once I wrapped the paper, the commentary, in that framing and made that explicit, it made a lot more sense to that editor, and in fact, they didn't require any changes. So it was for me, it was a really interesting instance of the value of making explicit that which is normally implicit when we are writing within disciplinary circles, or indeed within transdisciplinary circles. It was just speaking in a language that was familiar to the audiences, and that's the key thing, is to find ways to represent things in ways that are sufficiently familiar in order that an audience can take a step in and then take a step out, continue on the journey and go in places where they might not otherwise have gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I found it really, really refreshing. I think I told you, and at some point I was like really reading like what's gonna be next, what's gonna be the next step in
It's a page turner.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, page turner. And I think something I found really interesting, it was that the process was really well described of what had happened, and also what had been your own kind of mistakes in some ways without being conscious.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that sometimes we are not so honest when we write papers.
Exactly.
Right? We just kind of write a nice process that we did, but we don't describe the messiness around doing research. And I think I found that really, really good. And I would have liked to read more of that when I was starting my career, for example. That this is kind of the normal process, not usually. No.
Yeah, totally. And it's, I think, to kind of lift the veil, if you like, on the research process. My PhD students laugh about this, but it's a model that I've used for a long time now, and this is how we represent research, is that there's a target over here. I'm an archer. There's a target over here, and I'm drawing the bow, and the arrow is going to the middle of the target. And how research actually happens, how it unfolds. Here I am, I'm an archer. I let the arrow fly, and then I walk over there and I draw the target around the arrow.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's not how we talk about it.
Yeah. But that's something that it normally doesn't become explicit.
Exactly.
Yeah. I don't know, Rison, if you have any kind of final.
No, actually, I'm good. I think we went through the main thing I also wanted to discuss, and I guess we have to close now. But thank you very much, Cynthia, for making yourself available across all the very different time slots. We covered 3 different time slots, the 3 of us. So that's
great.
But thank you very much for this very interesting seminar. And so this seminar will remain online maybe forever on the IZ YouTube channel. So whoever wants to watch it or watch it again can. And we will keep everyone informed for the coming episodes of the Doing Ecological Economics seminar as well. But thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and thank you very much, Cynthia, for this very interesting discussion.
Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity, Louis, Don, and Paula.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and everyone. Like the paper is available online. Ecological Economics had made it open, so please go read it because you will enjoy it. Yeah, thanks so much, and we will close by now the streaming.
Bye, everyone.
Bye bye.